In the low country of Georgia in 1839, when the air itself seemed heavy with heat and unspoken sins, the Bellamy plantation stood apart not because it was grander than the others, but because of the woman who ruled it with a quiet, unsettling confidence that made even seasoned overseers uneasy. Margaret Bellamy had arrived there as a young widow with money, land, and no surviving kin to answer to. And from the moment her carriage rolled through the gates, people sensed something was wrong in a way they could not name. She did not mourn publicly, did not veil her face, did not lower her eyes when men spoke. Instead, she watched everything with a gaze that lingered too long, a gaze that made conversations falter and hearts race for reasons no one admitted aloud. She walked the grounds alone at dawn when other ladies slept, her bare hands brushing dew from magnolia leaves, her thin cotton dresses clinging to her body in a way that felt intentional rather than careless, and the enslaved men working the fields learned quickly that she saw them not as faceless labor but as individual bodies, individual presences, something far more dangerous than hatred because it carried curiosity. Every plantation in the county ran on rules older than memory, rules about distance and silence and who was allowed to look at whom, but Margaret Bellamy treated those rules like suggestions meant for weaker people. She spoke directly to the men, called them by name, corrected overseers in front of them, and smiled faintly when the men stiffened at her attention. Not cruelly, not kindly, but as if she was studying an experiment whose results pleased her. Whispers followed her through savannah and back again. Whispers of late-night gatherings, of laughter echoing from rooms where no guests were seen entering, of servants dismissed suddenly and sent away with generous coin and haunted eyes. But nothing prepared the plantation for what began one fog-drenched morning in early spring, when Margaret announced that the bath would be moved outdoors, near the slave quarters, not as punishment or practicality, but as preference. She explained it calmly, saying the house felt too closed, too stale, that she wanted air and light and openness, words that sounded harmless until the tub was placed in full view of the men's barracks. A heavy iron thing filled each morning with steaming water hauled from the fire pits, scented faintly with oils imported from Charleston, and on the first day, when the men were ordered to remain nearby during her bathing, confusion spread faster than fear. Some thought it a test, some a trick, some a mistake that would be corrected once she realized how improper it appeared. But Margaret Bellamy did not mistake anything. She arrived barefoot, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes calm, and stepped toward the tub as if she was stepping into a parlor rather than crossing a line that had never been crossed before. No command was given for the men to approach her, only to remain where they were, close enough to hear the water move, close enough to feel the heat rise against their skin, close enough to understand that they were meant to see and be seen without touching, without speaking, without escape. The silence was thick, broken only by cicadas and the soft sound of water shifting as she lowered herself in. And in that moment, something fundamental changed on the plantation, because humiliation was no longer loud or violent, it was quiet and intimate and deliberate. Margaret Bellamy did not leer or provoke in obvious ways. She did not laugh or taunt. She simply existed there, exposed and unashamed, reclaiming her body not as something to be hidden or protected, but as a weapon made of skin and nerve and intention. She spoke casually while bath. King, commenting on the weather, the yield of the cotton fields, the behavior of neighboring plantations. Her voice steady, almost soothing, while the men stood rigid, eyes burning from strain whether they dared look or forced themselves not to. And later that day, when the overseer suggested the practice might cause trouble, she dismissed him with a glance and reminded him whose land he stood on, whose signature paid his wages, whose word mattered more than tradition or comfort. From that morning on, the bath became ritual, and rituals have power beyond reason. They reshape fear into routine and routine into obedience. The men learned when to arrive, where to stand, how to hold themselves still while the water steamed and her presence filled the space like a held breath. And though no explicit command was ever spoken, the message was unmistakable. She was watching, always watching, measuring reactions, memorizing faces, learning who trembled and who hardened and who tried to disappear within themselves. And at night, when the quarters finally grew quiet, the memory of that morning lingered heavier than the day's labor, because physical exhaustion could be slept away, but the slow violation of boundaries lived on in the mind, twisting into dreams that felt wrong to have and impossible to stop. Margaret Bellamy understood this in a way no one else did. She understood that true control did not require chains or whips in every moment, only the certainty that she could summon vulnerability whenever she wished. And as the weeks passed, her presence seemed to deepen, as if the land itself bent slightly toward her will. Animals grew skittish near the bathing area. Birds fell silent when she arrived, and some of the older men, those who had seen many masters come and go, began to whisper that this woman was not simply cruel or indulgent, but hollow in a way that frightened them more than rage ever could, because there was no end to hunger that fed on power rather than flesh. And while the county ladies sipped tea and spoke of manners and virtue, Margaret Bellamy stood barefoot in the dirt each morning, steam curling around her like a living thing, rewriting the rules of fear one silent witness at a time, unaware or unconcerned that every ritual demands payment eventually, and that the line she crossed so calmly would not remain invisible forever. The second phase of the ritual settled into the plantation like a sickness that no one could name but everyone felt, because once the first boundary had been crossed without consequence, Margaret Bellamy refined it, slowed it, made it deliberate in a way that stripped away any hope that it might end on its own. The bath no longer felt like a shocking incident, but a scheduled certainty, something announced by the clang of metal and the hiss of boiling water poured into iron, something the men felt in their stomachs before it ever reached their eyes. She chose the same hour each morning when the sun had not yet burned away the fog, when the air clung damply to skin and breath felt thick in the lungs, and she insisted the men be present before she arrived, standing in a loose half-circle that she adjusted herself, moving one man a step to the left, another a step forward, correcting their positions with the calm focus of someone arranging furniture rather than human beings. Her instructions were never shouted, never harsh, which somehow made them worse, because there was no anger to react against, no emotional heat to cling to, only expectation, and when she finally appeared, she did so without ceremony, barefoot, unhurried, hair sometimes bound loosely and sometimes left to fall freely, her expression unreadable, not inviting and not ashamed, as if she had long ago decided that shame was a weakness she refused to carry. The water steamed heavily by then, fog mixing with vapor until the edges of the world blurred. And as she stepped closer, the men could feel the warmth roll toward them, a physical presence that made distance meaningless. She did not look at them all at once, but individually, her gaze landing and lingering just long enough to make each man aware of himself, of his posture, his breath, the direction of his eyes. And then she would lower herself into the tub slowly, the sound of water rising loud in the quiet morning, the surface rippling and sloshing against iron, a sound that followed them into their sleep whether they wanted it to or not. Once settled, she would rest her arms along the rim, fingers relaxed, shoulders bare to the damp air, and she would speak as if nothing unusual were happening, asking about work completed the day before, about which fields needed tending, about who had been ill and who had recovered, questions that forced answers, because silence was not permitted when spoken to directly. And so the men answered, voices low, eyes fixed on some point that was never quite safe, knowing that looking away too obviously was noted just as surely as looking too long. She listened with patience, nodding slightly, sometimes correcting a detail or asking a follow-up question, her interest genuine enough to unsettle, because it suggested memory and attention rather than indifference, and gradually the rules became clearer without ever being stated aloud. No one was allowed to leave until she dismissed them. No one was allowed to speak unless spoken to, and no one was allowed to pretend she was not there. The bath was no longer a spectacle but a shared confinement, a space where the men were made to witness and be witnessed without relief. And as days turned into weeks, subtle changes emerged that only someone like Margaret Bellamy would notice, appreciate. Shoulders stiffened differently, breath shortened, jaws clenched. Some men grew quieter outside the ritual, others more volatile, and she watched it all with an almost scholarly interest, adjusting nothing, allowing the pressure to build naturally because she understood that discomfort, when sustained, reshaped people more effectively than force. The overseers avoided the area now, inventing tasks elsewhere, unwilling to be part of something they did not understand and could not control. And this absence only deepened her authority, because, without witnesses who mattered, the ritual belonged entirely to her and those she compelled to attend. Occasionally she would add small variations, asking a man to step closer under the pretense of hearing him better, or commenting on the way steam clung to skin in the morning air, remarks delivered neutrally but charged by context. And though no physical contact ever occurred, the proximity itself became unbearable, a pressure that settled under the skin and crawled through thought. At night, the men lay awake replaying the sound of water and her voice, trying and failing to separate the image of her from the fear that accompanied it, because the two had fused into something inseparable. And Margaret Bellamy seemed to sense this internal unraveling, her own presence growing more assured, her movements more economical, as if she no longer questioned her place or her power. She lingered longer in the tub now, letting the water cool gradually, forcing the men to remain as the air shifted from warm to chill, as steam thinned and skin prickled, turning comfort into endurance. And still she spoke calmly, occasionally humming under her breath, a soft, tuneless sound that threaded itself into memory like a splinter. There were mornings when the fog was so thick that her form seemed half dissolved, her outline wavering. Anne. More than one man later swore that the water moved when she did not, that ripples spread across the surface without cause, but none dared speak of it aloud because the unspoken rule was this: the ritual existed only as long as it was endured without protest, without acknowledgement beyond obedience, and Margaret Bellamy relied on that silence as much as she relied on their presence. She had created a space where speaking felt dangerous, not because of punishment, but because it would make the experience real in a way that could not be contained. And so the days passed, each one layering unease atop the last, the bath becoming less about the act itself and more about the anticipation that preceded it and the residue it left behind. A slow corrosion of certainty and self, and through it all, she remained unchanged on the surface, composed, deliberate, her authority unchallenged, unaware or unconcerned, that rituals which feed on imbalance rarely remain stable, that something watched too closely for too long begins to look back, and that the quiet dread settling over the plantation was not dissipating but concentrating, waiting for the moment when endurance would fracture, and the ritual would demand more than silent witnesses. As the third stage of Margaret Bellamy's ritual took hold, something subtle but irreversible shifted, because by then the men no longer reacted with raw shock or confusion. Instead, a deeper, more corrosive fear began to settle in, the kind that seeps slowly into the mind and changes the shape of thought itself. The bath was no longer an event but an inevitability, anticipated hours before it happened, felt in the tightening of the chest during morning labor, in the way hands trembled slightly when lifting tools, in the way conversation thinned and eyes avoided one another long before the iron tub was filled. And Margaret sensed this change with an instinct that bordered on pleasure. She had always been attentive to atmospheres, to the invisible currents that passed between people. And now the plantation seemed tuned entirely to her presence. The men arrived earlier than commanded, lining up without instruction, standing where they knew she preferred them, their obedience no longer enforced but internalized, which was precisely what made it so powerful, because obedience chosen is harder to break than obedience beaten into the body. And when she arrived, she took longer to prepare, walking slowly, letting anticipation stretch thin, sometimes pausing to observe the men without speaking, her silence louder than any order, her gaze heavier than any chain. She began to change her behavior in ways that were small but deliberate, lingering on certain faces, asking the same man questions several mornings in a row, testing how his voice changed under sustained attention, noting who grew hoarse, who stumbled over words, who answered too quickly in a desperate attempt to please, and who grew quiet and distant, retreating inward as if that might offer protection. She learned their weaknesses not through force but through repetition, through the steady erosion of certainty, and the men felt it. Though they lacked language for it, they felt themselves becoming objects of study rather than labor, measured not by strength or output, but by reaction, by how visibly they suffered. And this inversion of purpose disturbed them more deeply than any beating ever had, because pain could be endured with anger, but exposure without release hollowed a person out. At night, dreams became vivid and tangled, filled with steam and still water, and the sound of her voice drifting from nowhere and everywhere. Some men woke convinced they could hear water sloshing outside the quarters. Others dreamed of standing frozen while roots grew around their feet, holding them in place as she watched. And these dreams followed them into waking life, blurring the line between memory and imagination until the bath felt endless, as if it never truly concluded but simply faded temporarily before returning. Margaret herself seemed to thrive in this atmosphere, her posture more relaxed, her movements precise, as if she were conserving energy for something that had not yet arrived. She stayed in the tub longer now, long enough for the water to cool noticeably, for steam to thin into mist, for gooseflesh to rise along her arms, and she did not flinch at the chill. Instead, she welcomed it, allowing discomfort to mark time, using endurance as another tool of dominance. And sometimes, when the men least expected it, she would fall silent mid-conversation and simply watch the surface of the water, her eyes unfocused, her expression distant, and in those moments the men felt something close to panic, because silence suggested thought, and thought suggested intention, and intention, in her case, was always dangerous. Rumors began to spread quietly among the quarters, not of sexual acts or overt cruelty, but of wrongness, of a feeling that something unseen had been invited into the ritual. So, meeting that fed on attention and fear alike, older men spoke in low voices of spirits tied to water, of places where boundaries thinned, though they never spoke within sight of the tub itself, because by then the bath had taken on a presence of its own, a focal point for dread. And there were mornings when the water seemed darker than it should have been, mornings when leaves drifted across its surface, though no wind stirred, mornings when the birds fell silent as Margaret approached. As if the land itself recognized her arrival, she began humming more often now, a low, tuneless sound that rose and fell without pattern, a sound that clung to the edges of hearing and lingered long after it stopped, and some men swore that the humming continued even when her lips were still, that it seemed to come from the water itself, but no one dared confirm this aloud, because to speak it would be to admit that the ritual had slipped beyond human control. Margaret never acknowledged these changes, never commented on the tension or the fear, but she responded to it subtly, positioning herself so that reflections played oddly across the water, her face sometimes distorted by ripples, sometimes doubled, sometimes appearing deeper than the tub itself should allow. And these visual tricks unsettled the men more than she could have achieved through direct confrontation, because they suggested instability, the possibility that perception itself could not be trusted. And when perception fails, obedience becomes the only anchor left. One morning, she asked a man why his hands shook when he spoke, her tone genuinely curious, and when he struggled for an answer, she nodded thoughtfully, as if filing the information away. And the next day his shaking was worse, because now he knew it had been seen, known, absorbed. This was how she worked, turning awareness into weapon, and the plantation began to change around this slow violence. Productivity dipped, tempers flared, small accidents increased, and still the bath continued, untouched by consequence, because no one knew how to interrupt something that had been normalized through repetition. Even Margaret herself seemed bound by it now, arriving each morning without fail, drawn to the tub as if by instinct, as if something waited for her there, something she could not name but could not abandon. And there were moments, brief and fleeting, when her expression flickered into something like uncertainty, moments when she stared too long at her reflection in the water, as if searching for something that did not answer back. But these moments passed quickly, replaced by composure, by control, by the calm certainty that fear was still flowing in the direction she intended. And yet beneath it all, Beneath the routine and the silence and the watchful eyes, something continued to build, a pressure that no longer belonged solely to her. Because fear, when concentrated and sustained, becomes a force of its own, unpredictable, unstable, and capable of turning inward or outward without warning. And though Margaret Bellamy believed herself the author of this ritual, the quiet truth was that she had created a space where desire, dread, and attention mixed too thoroughly to be contained. And the bath, once a symbol of her dominance, was slowly becoming something else entirely. Something that watched her as closely as she watched the men. Something that waited patiently beneath the surface, gathering strength from every silent witness. By the time the fourth movement of the ritual unfolded, the plantation no longer felt like a place governed by people, but by momentum, as if something had been set in motion that no single will could now stop, because endurance had quietly transformed into erosion, and erosion, when ignored, always leads to collapse. The men still arrived each morning, still stood where they were expected, but the quality of their presence had changed. Their bodies were there, yet their attention wavered, drifting inward or outward in ways that Margaret Bellamy noticed immediately, and this loss of sharp focus displeased her, not because it threatened her authority, but because it suggested that fear was no longer clean or contained. It had begun to fray, to scatter, to seek outlets of its own, and so she adjusted the ritual again, not by adding cruelty, but by narrowing it, tightening it like a noose drawn slowly rather than jerked. She reduced the number of men required to attend, selecting them herself with no explanation, a choice that unsettled everyone, because absence could be just as dangerous as presence. Those not chosen wondered why, and those chosen wondered what they had done to be seen, and this uncertainty deepened the atmosphere of dread more effectively than any shouted threat ever could. The chosen men stood closer now, the half-circle smaller, the space between iron tub and flesh reduced until warmth and breath mingled, until the sound of water felt louder, heavier, almost intrusive, and Margaret lingered in silence longer than before, sometimes arriving and not entering the tub at all at first, pacing slowly around it, her bare feet pressing into damp earth, leaving faint impressions that filled quickly with water and disappeared, a detail some of the men noticed with growing unease, because it felt symbolic in a way they could not articulate. She spoke less now, and when she did, her questions were oddly specific, asking about dreams, about sleep, about moments of forgetfulness during the day, inquiries delivered calmly, almost gently, but charged with an intimacy that made the men's skin crawl, because these were things they had not spoken of even among themselves, and yet she seemed to know they were happening, as if the ritual had given her access to spaces that should have remained private. The bath itself began to change as well, not physically at first, but in how it was perceived. The water often appeared darker despite being freshly drawn, its surface less reflective, more absorbent, swallowing light rather than bouncing it back. And when Margaret finally entered it, she did so with a gravity that suggested intention rather than habit, lowering herself slowly, closing her eyes briefly as if listening for something beneath the surface, and in those moments the men felt a collective tightening, a sense that whatever this ritual had become was now deeper than humiliation or control. It felt like invocation, though none would have used that word aloud, and the plantation responded in subtle but unmistakable ways. The air near the bathing area felt cooler even on warm mornings, insects avoided it, tools left nearby rusted faster than expected, and the soil retained moisture long after it should have dried. These changes were small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they created a sense of wrongness that seeped into everything. Margaret herself appeared altered too, her skin paler, her eyes shadowed as if she slept poorly, yet her focus sharpened, her movements more economical, more purposeful, as if she were conserving herself for the ritual rather than expending energy elsewhere. She stopped attending social functions, ignored correspondence, dismissed visitors, narrowing her world until it consisted almost entirely of the plantation and the bath, and when overseers attempted to raise concerns about productivity or morale, she silenced them with a look that made further protest impossible, because by then her authority felt absolute, not backed by law or violence, but by something quieter and more oppressive. A certainty that resistance would only make things worse in ways no one could predict. Then came the morning when one of the chosen men failed to appear, his absence immediate and glaring in the tightened formation. Margaret noticed at once, her gaze flicking to the empty space with a stillness that made the others' hearts pound. She asked no questions, issued no commands. She simply waited, minutes stretching unbearably long, the silence thick enough to choke on, until finally she nodded once and proceeded with the ritual as if nothing were amiss. But that absence lingered like a wound that would not close, because no explanation followed. The man did not appear later in the day. His tools lay where he had left them, his sleeping space untouched, and yet no search was organized, no punishment announced. It was as if he had been quietly erased, and this erasure frightened the men more than any visible violence could have, because it suggested that disappearance was now possible without acknowledgement, that the ritual did not merely humiliate or frighten but consumed, and the bath itself seemed to bear witness to this shift. The water that morning was unmistakably tinged, faintly at first, a discoloration that could have been dismissed as sediment or rust, but over the following days it persisted, deepened, resisted explanation, and Margaret noticed it too, her eyes lingering on the surface longer than usual, her expression unreadable, and yet she did not order the tub replaced or the water tested. She accepted the change with a calm that unsettled those forced to stand. Nearby, because acceptance implied understanding, or worse, expectation, she stayed in the bath longer than ever before during this period, remaining even as the air cooled, as mist settled thickly around them, as the men's muscles cramped from standing, and during these extended sessions she sometimes appeared to drift, her head tilting back slightly, her breathing slowing, and in these moments the men felt an almost unbearable pressure, as if the space around the tub had grown heavier, denser, charged with something that pressed against their senses. Some later said they felt watched from below, not by her, but by something else, something patient and curious, and when she finally emerged from the tub on those mornings, she did so slowly, water streaming from her skin, her expression distant, and she dismissed the men with a single gesture, leaving them shaken, exhausted, and unsure whether what they had just experienced belonged to the waking world or something else entirely. Rumors spread quietly after the disappearance, though never in full sentences, only fragments exchanged in glances and half-spoken phrases, and these rumors fed the growing sense that the ritual had crossed a threshold, that it was no longer sustained solely by Margaret's will, but by something that had taken root within it, something that required continuation, and Margaret herself seemed bound by it now, compelled to return each morning despite the toll it took on her, because she too appeared thinner, more strained, as if the ritual demanded as much from her as it did from the men, and yet she did not stop, could not stop, because stopping would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean admitting that the bath had become more than an assertion of power. It had become a site of exchange, fear flowing in, something else flowing out, and as the plantation moved deeper into this unspoken understanding, it became clear that the disappearance was not an ending but a beginning, a signal that the ritual had learned it could take without being questioned, and that whatever lay beneath the surface of that darkening water was no longer content with silent witnesses alone. As the fifth stretch of the ritual unfolded, time itself seemed to lose its usual shape on the Bellamy plantation, days blending together not through monotony but through a thickening sense that everything now revolved around the bath, that all labor, all sleep, all thought merely existed to support those silent hours at dawn when steam rose and fear gathered, and by then the men no longer spoke of the ritual even in whispers, because it had moved beyond language, beyond rumor, settling instead into the body as a constant tension, a low ache behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest that never fully released. Margaret Bellamy appeared increasingly distant from the world outside this narrowing orbit. Her interactions brief and transactional, her attention reserved almost entirely for the mornings, and those mornings grew stranger, heavier, as if each one carried more weight than the last. She arrived earlier now, sometimes before the men were fully assembled, standing beside the tub in the dim half-light, her silhouette barely visible through fog and steam, and there were moments when the men wondered if she had been there all along, waiting, watching them approach. The water itself had changed unmistakably by this point, no longer clear even when freshly drawn, its surface dull and dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, and when it moved it did so sluggishly, thickly, as if resisting disturbance. And Margaret seemed aware of this difference, responding to it with a kind of reverence, her movements slower, more deliberate, her entry into the tub almost ceremonial, lowering her self inch by inch, pausing as if listening, as if feeling for something beneath the surface. And during these pauses, the men felt an oppressive stillness settle over the clearing, birds falling silent, insects retreating, even the wind seeming to hesitate. And when she finally settled into the water, she closed her eyes for longer than before, her breathing deep and measured, as though aligning herself with some unseen rhythm. And it was during this period that the men began to notice changes in her that could not be explained by fatigue alone. Her skin appeared almost translucent in the early light, veins faintly visible, her eyes darker, more reflective, as if they held depths that were not there before. And when she looked at the men, her gaze felt different, less evaluative and more distant, as if she were seeing them through something else rather than directly. She spoke rarely now, and when she did, her words were simple, sometimes oddly out of place, remarks about water temperature, about stillness, about the way sound traveled differently in the morning air, observations that felt less like conversation and more like commentary addressed to no one in particular, and this withdrawal of direct engagement unsettled the men profoundly, because it removed even the illusion of human interaction, leaving them as witnesses to something unfolding beyond their comprehension. The absence of the man who had disappeared lingered heavily during this time, his empty place a constant reminder that something could be taken without explanation, without acknowledgement, and the fear this generated began to manifest physically. Men grew gaunt, their sleep shallow and fragmented. Some flinched at the sound of water being poured, others avoided washing entirely, as if contact with water itself had become dangerous, and a few began to mutter quietly to themselves during the ritual word. Too soft to understand, prayers perhaps, or pleas, or attempts to anchor themselves to something familiar. And Margaret noticed these changes with a detached curiosity, her head tilting slightly when a man's lips moved, her eyes narrowing when someone trembled too visibly. And yet she did not correct or punish these behaviors. She allowed them, as if they served a purpose, as if fear expressed was as valuable as fear contained, and the plantation responded in kind. Livestock refused to drink from troughs near the bathing area, tools left nearby corroded rapidly, wood swelled and split, and even the soil felt different underfoot, spongy and cold, retaining moisture long after rain had passed. And there were mornings when the fog clung so thickly that the men could barely see Margaret's form in the tub, only the dark mass of water and the faint pale shape within it. And in those moments some swore they saw movement beneath the surface that did not match her breathing or her shifting weight, subtle currents that suggested depth far greater than the tub should have held, but no one spoke of this aloud, because to acknowledge it would be to admit that the ritual had become something other than an act imposed by a woman on men. It had become an exchange, and exchanges imply mutual influence. Margaret herself seemed caught in this exchange now, her strength waning even as her focus sharpened, her hands occasionally trembling when she emerged from the bath, her steps unsteady for a moment before she composed herself. And there were days when she remained near the tub long after dismissing the men, standing alone, staring into the dark water, as if reluctant to leave it, as if something pulled at her from below, and this reluctance did not go unnoticed, because it suggested dependence, a need that mirrored the compulsion felt by those she summoned, and this realization, unset, led the men in a new way, because it hinted that whatever power she wielded was no longer entirely her own, that she too was bound by the ritual she had created. And as this understanding spread quietly among them, fear began to mingle with something else, a fragile, dangerous sense of possibility, not hope, but the awareness that systems sustained by imbalance eventually strain under their own weight, that rituals fed by fear can consume their architect as readily as their victims, and this awareness did not free them, but it changed the quality of their endurance, lending it a sharp edge, a watchfulness directed not only at Margaret, but at the bath itself, at the moments when her composure faltered, at the way the water seemed to respond to her presence more than to gravity or heat. And there came a morning when she entered the tub and did not speak at all, did not look at the men, did not move once she settled, remaining perfectly still as the water gradually cooled around her, the silence stretching until it felt unbearable, until the men's breathing grew loud in their ears, and in that silence something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a sense that the ritual was reaching toward a threshold, that it was gathering itself for a change that could no longer be delayed. And when Margaret finally opened her eyes that morning, there was something in them that had not been there before. A depth, a shadow, a suggestion of recognition, as if she had looked into the water and found something looking back, something that knew her now, and the men felt it too, an unspoken certainty that whatever had been invited into the ritual was no longer content to remain passive, that it had learned the shape of fear and the rhythm of obedience, and that it was preparing to claim more than silent witnesses, that the bath, once a symbol of her dominance, had become a doorway, and that both sides of that doorway were beginning to blur. By the final days of the ritual, the Bellamy plantation existed in a state that could no longer be called normal or even human. It felt suspended, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to arrive, and Margaret Bellamy moved through this suspended world like someone already halfway gone, her presence quieter now, her voice rarely heard beyond brief instructions, her eyes carrying a depth that unsettled even those who no longer reacted outwardly to fear. The men still came when summoned, though summoning had become unnecessary, their bodies responding automatically to the hour, to the sound of water being drawn, to the faint metallic echo of the tub being adjusted, because by then resistance no longer felt possible, not because of punishment, but because the ritual had rewritten their sense of time and choice. And on the final morning the fog was heavier than it had ever been, clinging to the ground so thickly that the world beyond a few feet dissolved entirely, swallowing trees, buildings, borders, until the bath clearing felt like the only place that existed, a small island of iron and water floating in nothingness. Margaret arrived before anyone else that morning, standing beside the tub long enough that when the men finally assembled, they were unsure whether she had just arrived or had been there all along, watching them approach through the fog, and she did not acknowledge them at first, did not arrange their positions or adjust their distance. She simply stood still, one hand resting lightly on the rim of the tub, her fingers tracing the cold metal as if memorizing it. And when she finally turned to face them, her expression was calm in a way that felt final, not serene, but resolved, as though a decision had already been made and could not be reversed. The water in the tub was darker than ever, not merely tinted but opaque, its surface dull and thick, barely rippling even when she disturbed it, and for a moment she hesitated, something flickering across her face that might have been doubt or recognition or farewell, but it passed quickly. Replaced by the composure she had worn like armor since the beginning, she entered the tub slowly, deliberately, lowering herself until the water reached her shoulders, and as she settled, the fog seemed to draw closer, muffling sounds, swallowing edges, until even the men standing just a few steps away felt distant, unreal. And Margaret closed her eyes, her breathing deepening, synchronizing with something unseen, and for a long stretch of time nothing happened, no movement, no sound beyond the faint drip of condensation sliding from leaves and iron. And in that stillness, the men felt a pressure build, not sharp or violent, but immense, like standing beneath deep water, a weight that pressed inward rather than down, and then the water moved, not with a splash or ripple, but with a slow, deliberate swell from below, as if something beneath the surface had shifted its position, and Margaret's eyes opened, her gaze fixed not on the men but downward, into the tub, and for the first time since the ritual began, she spoke words that were not commands or observations, her voice low, almost reverent, as if addressing something that had been listening all along, and though the men could not hear the exact words, they felt their effect, a subtle vibration in the air, a tightening in the chest, a sense that a boundary had been acknowledged and crossed simultaneously. The water rose slightly, spilling over the rim in thick, sluggish streams that soaked into the earth and did not spread, as if absorbed instantly, and Margaret did not react with alarm. She did not attempt to stand or call out. Instead, she leaned back sly, idly surrendering her weight to the tub, her expression unreadable, her breathing steady, and in that moment the men understood something without language, that the ritual had reached its conclusion not through violence or rebellion, but through completion, through fulfillment of whatever exchange had been unfolding all along, and the fog thickened further, swallowing the edges of Margaret's form, until only the dark mass of water remained clearly visible, and then even that began to change, its surface trembling, bulging upward in a way that defied reason, and some of the men staggered back instinctively, though none fled, because fear had long ago burned away their capacity for sudden movement, and then, without sound, without struggle, Margaret Bellamy disappeared beneath the surface, not pulled, not dragged, but accepted, the water closing over her with unnatural smoothness, leaving the tub filled to the brim, its surface finally still, and the silence that followed was absolute, heavier than anything that had come before. Minutes passed or hours, time no longer had meaning and no one moved, because there was nothing left to respond to. Eventually the fog began to thin, retreating slowly, reluctantly, revealing the clearing once more, the tub still there, still filled, but Margaret gone, and when the men finally approached, compelled by some mixture of dread and necessity, they found no trace of her, no disturbance, no sign that a body had ever occupied that space, only the dark water, opaque and unreadable, and one by one they stepped back, understanding without instruction that the ritual was over, not because it had been stopped, but because it had taken what it required. Word of Margaret Bellamy's disappearance spread quickly beyond the plantation, whispered explanations offered, illness, madness, flight, but no search ever yielded results, no body found, no evidence discovered, and the plantation itself changed rapidly afterward. The bathtub was removed, the clearing abandoned, the land slowly reclaimed by weeds and water. Yet the sense of wrongness never fully faded. Even years later, workers avoided the area at dawn. Animals refused to graze nearby, and travelers passing through swore they sometimes heard the faint sound of water shifting in the fog, a low, rhythmic movement accompanied by a woman's voice humming softly, patiently, as if continuing a ritual that no longer required witnesses, and those who heard it never stayed long, because something about that sound carried understanding, the unsettling certainty that some forms of power do not end when their wielders disappear, that rituals built on fear and attention can outlive their creators, and that beneath still water something always remembers.